Black mechanic saves vintage jet family's future changes forever. We don't allow unauthorized mechanics in the hangar, especially not with that vintage Lockheed. Security will escort you out, sir. With all due respect, Mr. Davidson, I've been working on these engines since Vietnam. Your family's jet won't fly without me, and you've got 3 hours before your father misses his final chance at treatment. The tension in the private airport hangar was palpable as James Monroe, a 65-year-old black mechanic with calloused hands and steady eyes, stood his ground against Bradley Davidson III, the 40-year-old heir to the Davidson aviation fortune. Behind them loomed the elegant silhouette of a 1962 Lockheed JetStar, its polished aluminum skin gleaming under the harsh hangar lights, but its engines dismantled and parts scattered across a tarp on the concrete floor. Bradley's face flushed with anger and desperation. His father, the family patriarch, lay in an ambulance outside, needing to reach a specialized medical facility in Chicago within the next 4 hours. Their family jet, a vintage aircraft that had been in the Davidson family for 3 generations, was their only hope after a sudden airport closure had grounded all commercial flights. "You have no idea what's at stake," Bradley hissed, stepping closer to James. "My father will die if we don't. I know exactly what's at stake," James interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "And that's why you need to let me work, now." Security guards hovered uncertainly at the entrance waiting for Bradley's signal. The ambulance workers outside checked their watches. Time was running out. "Fine," Bradley finally conceded, backing away. "But if anything happens to that plane or my father, I'll make sure you never work on an aircraft again." But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when James Monroe had arrived for what he thought would be a routine day at Davidson Regional Airport. James pulled his worn Ford pickup into the employee lot at 6:15 a.m., the same as he had done for the past 30 years. The dashboard clock was still set to the old time. He'd never bothered to change it after daylight savings, but his internal clock was impeccable. 15 minutes early, just as the Air Force had taught him back in '75. The small regional airport served the wealthy communities surrounding Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. While not particularly busy with commercial traffic, its hangars housed an impressive collection of private aircraft belonging to Chicago's elite who maintained summer homes in the area. James had worked his way up from general maintenance to become the airport's most respected mechanic, particularly for vintage aircraft that required knowledge most younger mechanics simply didn't possess. He nodded to the security guard at the gate. "Morning, Pete." "Morning, James. Gonna be a hot one today," Pete replied, sliding his coffee mug across the metal desk of the security booth. "Always is in August," James said with a slight smile, continuing toward the staff locker room. As James changed into his work coveralls, Raymond Jenkins, a younger mechanic in his 40s who had been mentored by James for the last decade, burst through the door. "James, thank God you're here. We've got a situation with the Davidson JetStar." James raised an eyebrow. The Davidson family's 1962 Lockheed JetStar was a beautiful piece of aviation history, one of the first dedicated business jets ever produced. Old man William Davidson, now in his 80s, had purchased it second-hand back in 1970 and kept it in immaculate condition. "What's wrong with it?" James asked, zipping up his coveralls. "Everything," Raymond said, his face grim. "Some hotshot mechanic from Chicago was working on it yesterday. Bradley Davidson brought him in, said he was the best. Well, that best took apart the starboard engines for inspection and then had a heart attack right in the hangar." James winced. "Is he all right?" "They took him to the hospital last night. But the engines are in pieces, and now the Davidsons need the plane today. Emergency medical transport for the old man. They're saying it's his last chance for some experimental treatment in Chicago," James sighed. The JetStar was a complicated machine under the best circumstances. With partially disassembled engines and no notes from the previous mechanic, it would be a challenge. "Why not use a medical helicopter?" James asked. "Weather's too unstable for the smaller choppers, and commercial flights are grounded due to that computer system failure they're having nationwide. This is their only option." James nodded, processing the information. "All right, let me see what we're dealing with." When they arrived at Hangar 7, the situation was even worse than Raymond had described. Parts were spread across tarps with no apparent organization. The Davidson family had gathered near the aircraft, Bradley pacing nervously while his wife Allison sat rigid in a folding chair, their teenage daughter Sophia glued to her phone, though her eyes betrayed worry. Outside the hangar doors, James could see an ambulance waiting, presumably with William Davidson inside. As James approached the aircraft, Bradley Davidson intercepted him, his expensive suit and perfectly coiffed hair in stark contrast to James' practical coveralls. "You're Monroe?" Bradley asked, not extending his hand. "Yes, sir, James Monroe." "They tell me you know old planes," Bradley said, skepticism evident in his voice as his eyes quickly assessed James. "My father needs to be in Chicago in 4 hours for a treatment that could save his life. Can you fix this mess?" James studied the disassembled engine parts before answering. "I'll need to see what we're dealing with first, Mr. Davidson." "We don't have time for assessments," Bradley snapped. "I need to know if you can fix it or if I need to find another solution immediately." James met his gaze steadily. "I've been working on these Lockheed engines since before you were born, Mr. Davidson. Give me 30 minutes to assess, then I'll tell you exactly what we're looking at." Bradley checked his watch, clearly displeased but out of options. 30 minutes, not a second more. As Bradley walked away, Raymond whispered, "The old man's cancer has spread. This treatment in Chicago is experimental last chance kind of thing. They only had a 48-hour window to get him there after some preparation treatment, and that window closes today." James nodded grimly. "Let's get to work." For the next half hour, James carefully examined each disassembled component, creating a mental inventory and reconstruction plan. The previous mechanic had been in the middle of replacing several critical seals when he'd fallen ill. James could see the problem immediately. The fuel control system had been showing signs of deterioration, a common issue with these vintage engines. After exactly 30 minutes, Bradley returned, tension radiating from him. "Well, I can fix it," James said confidently, "but it will take at least 2.5 hours, maybe 3. 3 hours, Bradley exploded. "That's cutting it too close. The treatment window closes at noon sharp." "Mr. Davidson, I understand the urgency. But rushing this job could mean engine failure midair, which would help nobody, least of all your father." Bradley ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with the decision. "Do it," he finally said, "but if we miss this window because of you." The threat hung in the air, unfinished but clear. James turned to Raymond. "I need the special toolkit from my locker and the gasket set we've been saving for the museum restoration." As Raymond hurried away, James began organizing the parts in the proper reassembly sequence. His hands, though aged, moved with the precision and confidence that came from decades of experience. Allison Davidson approached, her silk blouse and tailored slacks unable to hide her exhaustion. "Thank you for trying," she said quietly. "William means everything to this family." James nodded. "I understand, ma'am. I'll do my best." "Bradley is he's under a lot of pressure. His relationship with his father has always been complicated." "Family usually is," James replied, his focus still on the parts before him. Over the next hour, James worked methodically, his movements efficient and purposeful. Bradley paced the hangar, checking his watch obsessively while occasionally stepping outside to check on his father in the ambulance. Sophia, the teenage granddaughter, eventually wandered over to watch James work. "Grandpa says you're the best mechanic he's ever known," she said unexpectedly. James looked up, surprised. "Your grandfather said that?" Sophia nodded. "He told me stories about how you kept the crop dusters running when all the farmers were going bankrupt in the 80s, said you worked for parts sometimes when people couldn't pay." James smiled slightly, remembering those difficult years. "Your grandfather has a good memory. He says you served together, in Vietnam." James' hands paused momentarily. "Not together exactly. He was an officer, I was just a maintenance crew member, different worlds." "But the same war," Sophia observed. James nodded, returning to his work. "The same war." As the second hour of work began, James encountered an unexpected problem. One of the custom gaskets he needed had been improperly stored and had deteriorated. "Raymond," he called, "we need a fabricated gasket. The original's shot and the replacement is warped." Raymond's face fell. "The fabrication shop is closed until Monday, James." Bradley, overhearing this, stormed over. "What does that mean? You said you could fix it." "I can," James said calmly, "but I need to hand-cut a gasket from stock material. It will add some time." "Time we don't have," Bradley shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the hangar. "I knew we should have flown him out yesterday, but you insisted he needed rest, Allison." "Your father could barely sit up yesterday," Allison fired back, her composure cracking. "The doctor said, I don't care what the doctor said. If he misses this treatment window, it's over, all of it." James continued working during their argument, his experienced hands already cutting the replacement gasket from a sheet of specialized material he kept in his personal toolkit. "Mr. Davidson," James interrupted firmly, "this arguing isn't helping your father or the timeline. I need complete focus to safely finish this job." Bradley turned his anger toward James. "Don't you dare tell me how to, Bradley," a weak voice called from the hangar entrance. Everyone turned to see William Davidson being wheeled in by a paramedic. The elderly man looked frail, his skin papery and yellowed from his illness, but his eyes were sharp and commanding. "William, you should be resting," Allison said, hurrying to his side. "I heard the commotion," William said, his voice thin but authoritative. "James Monroe is the finest aircraft mechanic I've ever known. If he says he needs focus, then everyone shut up and let him work." The elder Davidson's eyes met James's across the hangar, and a moment of understanding passed between them, two men who had seen war together, albeit from different positions in the military hierarchy, and who respected competence above all else. "Thank you, sir," James said simply, returning to his task. William nodded, then addressed his son. "Bradley, come outside with me. We need to talk." As father and son left the hangar, an uncomfortable silence fell. James worked steadily, aware of the passing time but refusing to rush procedures that could compromise safety. Allison returned to her seat, and Sophia watched James with undisguised fascination. "How did you learn to do all this?" she asked after a while. "Air Force taught me the basics during Vietnam," James replied as he carefully fitted the newly cut gasket. "After that, it was just practice and paying attention. These old planes, they talk to you if you listen. Grandpa says you saved his life once, during the war." James' hand stilled for just a moment. "Your grandfather gives me too much credit. I just did my job. He said his plane had mechanical issues after a mission. Everyone else said it was fine, but you insisted it wasn't safe. The next day, they found a critical failure that would have caused a crash." James remained focused on his work. "Like I said, these machines talk to you if you listen." Outside the hangar, the conversation between Bradley and his father had grown heated, their voices occasionally carrying inside despite their efforts to keep them down. "You've always been too proud to ask for help," William's strained voice accused. "Just like with the company restructuring, you tried to handle it yourself and nearly ran us into bankruptcy." "I fixed that problem, didn't I?" Bradley shot back. "Without selling out to investors like you wanted. By leveraging everything we own, including this plane." Their voices faded as they moved further from the hangar, but the tension remained palpable. Raymond returned with additional tools James had requested, whispering, "Everyone at the airport is talking about this, if you pull this off." "Just hand me that torque wrench," James replied, uninterested in airport gossip. By the beginning of the third hour, James had successfully reassembled one engine and was making rapid progress on the second. His coveralls were stained with grease and sweat dampened his brow, but his movements remained precise and confident. Bradley returned alone, his expression unreadable. He stood silently watching James work for several minutes before speaking. "My father told me something I didn't know," he said finally. "About how you turned down a job offer from him after Vietnam. Said he tried to hire you as head of maintenance for Davidson Aviation, but you refused." James continued working, not looking up. "That was a long time ago. Why did you say no? It would have been a significant step up from working at a small regional airport." James tightened a bolt to exact specifications before answering. "I had my reasons. My father thinks you turned him down because of how he treated you during the war. He feels guilty about it." James finally paused, looking directly at Bradley. "Your father was a young officer with responsibilities I couldn't imagine. We all did and said things during war that we might regret in peacetime. That's not why I turned him down." "Then why?" "Because I wanted to build something of my own," James said simply. "Not just be a part of someone else's legacy. Out here, I've helped keep dozens of small agricultural businesses flying when they couldn't afford new planes. Kept air mail running to rural communities during the blizzard of '79. Some things matter more than a corner office." Bradley seemed about to respond when Raymond rushed into the hangar. "Airport's closing completely, storm front moving in faster than expected. They're grounding everything for at least 6 hours once it hits." "How long do we have?" James asked sharply. "Maybe 45 minutes before it's too dangerous for takeoff." Bradley checked his watch in panic. "Even if you finish the repairs right now, that still barely gives us enough time to get to Chicago before the treatment window closes." "Then we better not waste time talking," James said, turning back to the engine with renewed urgency. The next 30 minutes passed in tense silence as James worked with remarkable efficiency. Allison had rejoined William in the ambulance to check his condition, while Sophia continued to observe James from a respectful distance. Just as James was completing the final connections, Bradley approached again, his posture less confrontational than before. "My father mentioned something else," he said quietly, so only James could hear. "About a mechanic's son who wanted to be a pilot. Said the young man had real talent but couldn't afford flight school after his father had an accident that left him unable to work. James' hands never paused in their work, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My son made his own path, James replied evenly. Michael's a commercial airline captain now, worked his way through school as a baggage handler. My father seems to think he could have helped, but you never asked. Never needed to, James said firmly. Some lessons are worth more than shortcuts. Michael learned the value of hard work and independence. Can't put a price on that. Bradley protested. It's not a waste. It's the difference between reaching Chicago safely or not reaching it at all. Their standoff was interrupted by William Davidson, who had wheeled himself back into the hangar unassisted. Despite his physical weakness, his voice carried authority. Listen to him, Bradley. James doesn't cut corners, never has. Bradley hesitated, clearly torn between urgency and caution. 10 minutes, he finally agreed. Not 1 second more. James nodded and began the methodical process of testing the engines. The first started smoothly, its familiar hum filling the hangar. The second, however, revealed a minor adjustment was needed to the fuel mixture. James made the correction quickly but thoroughly. She's ready, he announced exactly 9 minutes later. A flurry of activity followed. The pilots, who had been waiting in the lounge, quickly boarded to begin their pre-flight checks. Paramedics carefully transferred William to the aircraft, with Allison close behind. Bradley supervised everything with tense efficiency. As the family prepared to board, William gestured for James to approach his wheelchair. You've still got the touch, Monroe, the elder Davidson said, extending a trembling hand. James took it carefully. Safe travels, sir. That offer still stands, you know. Davidson Aviation could use someone who values quality over expedience. James smiled slightly. We both know I'm too old for new tricks, sir. And too stubborn, William added with a hint of his old sharpness. Bradley could learn something from you if he'd listen. He seems like a man who makes his own decisions, like his father. William's expression softened. Too much like his father, perhaps. He glanced toward Bradley, who was speaking urgently with the pilots. He's under tremendous pressure. The company, my health. He's not always at his best these days. Few of us are under pressure. As the final preparations were made, dark clouds were visible on the horizon, the approaching storm front moving faster than predicted. The air had that charged quality that precedes significant weather. Bradley approached James one last time. The pilots say we'll make it to Chicago with 20 minutes to spare if we leave now, if this works, if my father gets this treatment. I just fixed the plane, Mr. Davidson, James said. The rest is up to the doctors. Bradley nodded awkwardly, then surprised James by extending his hand. Thank you. James accepted the handshake with a nod. As the Davidson family boarded, Sophia lingered behind. My grandpa said to give you this, she said, pressing a folded piece of paper into James' hand before hurrying onto the plane. Outside, the wind had picked up considerably. The storm was advancing quickly, making the timing even more critical. James and Raymond watched from the hangar doorway as the JetStar's engines fired up perfectly, the vintage aircraft beginning its taxi toward the runway. You did it, Raymond said with admiration. Cut it close, though. Too close, James agreed, watching the aircraft until it disappeared from view. Only then did he unfold the paper Sophia had given him. It contained a brief note in William Davidson's shaky handwriting. Some debts can never be repaid, but they should always be acknowledged. Thank you. WD beneath this was a check for an amount that made James' eyes widen. Raymond peered over his shoulder and whistled. That's more than either of us makes in a year. James carefully refolded the paper. It's not about the money. Then what is it about? Before James could answer, his phone rang. It was the control tower. Mr. Monroe, we have a situation. The Davidson jet is reporting instrument irregularities. They're concerned about continuing in the approaching weather. James straightened immediately. Put me through to their pilot. A moment later, he was speaking directly with the JetStar's captain, listening carefully to the description of the problem. His expression grew increasingly concerned. It's the electrical system, he said after hanging up. Not the engines, must have been affected by the work the previous mechanic was doing. Can they make it to Chicago? Raymond asked. Not safely through this storm, James said grimly. They need to return for repairs. When the JetStar taxied back to the hangar 20 minutes later, Bradley Davidson was the first to disembark, his face a mask of barely contained fury and desperation. You said it was fixed, he accused as he strode toward James. The engines are perfect, James replied calmly, but there's an electrical issue affecting the instruments. In this weather, flying with compromised instruments would be suicidal. We have less than 3 hours before my father's treatment window closes. Every minute counts. I understand that. Let me see what we're dealing with. And this brings us back to where our story began, with Bradley attempting to have security remove James from the hangar in a moment of desperate frustration. After Bradley reluctantly allowed James to stay and work on the electrical system, a tense silence filled the hangar. William Davidson had remained in the aircraft, too weak to be moved unnecessarily. Allison sat beside him, while Sophia paced nervously near the hangar doors, watching the storm clouds gathering with increasing concern. James worked with intense focus, tracing the electrical pathways with experienced hands. The problem was elusive, an intermittent connection that was difficult to pinpoint. "James," Raymond said quietly after 30 minutes of troubleshooting, "the tower just radioed. The storm's intensified. They're shutting down all departures completely in 15 minutes, no exceptions. After that, nothing flies until it passes." Bradley overheard and approached, his expression grim. "Please tell me you found the problem." "Almost," James said, not looking up from his work. His fingers traced a bundle of wires running behind an access panel that was rarely opened. "Here," he finally said, exposing a section where the insulation had worn away, causing a short circuit when the aircraft vibrated at certain frequencies. "Can you fix it in time?" Bradley asked, his earlier hostility replaced by naked hope. James assessed the damage. "Yes, but we'll be cutting it extremely close." "Do it," Bradley said simply. As James carefully repaired the damaged wiring, Bradley moved to the aircraft steps to check on his father. Their conversation was muted but intense, occasionally loud enough for fragments to reach James' ears. "Tried to tell you about the company's situation," William's weak voice said. "Not now, Dad," Bradley responded. "We need to focus on getting you to Chicago." "There might not be another time," William insisted. "You need to understand before it's too late." Their voices dropped again, the conversation continuing privately while James completed the repair. Thunder rumbled outside, much closer now, and rain began to patter against the hangar roof. With 5 minutes remaining before the airport's complete shutdown, James closed the access panel. "It's fixed," he announced. "You can fly safely now, but you need to leave immediately." Bradley hurried back, his face showing the strain of the day's events. "The pilots are ready. They say if we leave right now, and if the headwinds aren't too strong, we might still make Chicago just before the treatment window closes." As the engines were started for the second time that day, James noticed something subtle in their sound, a slight irregularity in the port engine that hadn't been there before. "Wait," he called out, moving quickly toward the cockpit. Bradley intercepted him. "No more delays, Monroe. We're leaving now." "There's something wrong with the port engine," James insisted. "I can hear it." "The engines are fine, you said so yourself." "Something's changed," James said firmly. "Possibly from the vibration during the first takeoff attempt. I need 5 minutes to check it." "We don't have 5 minutes," Bradley shouted over the increasing engine noise. "The airport's closing. The treatment window is barely reachable as it is." Inside the aircraft, William Davidson's voice called out weakly. "What's happening?" Bradley hesitated, torn between his father's urgent medical needs and the potential safety risk. The pilots looked on anxiously from the cockpit, awaiting instruction. In that moment of indecision, James did something unprecedented. He walked directly to the aircraft steps, climbed aboard, and approached William Davidson. "Sir," he said respectfully but firmly, "there's an issue with the port engine that needs checking before takeoff. It will take 5 minutes, but the airport is closing operations due to the storm." William looked from James to his son, understanding the impossible situation. "If we delay, we miss the treatment window," he stated. "Yes, sir," James acknowledged. "But if that engine fails over Lake Michigan in this storm?" William nodded slowly, the weight of a lifetime of decisions evident in his tired eyes. "Bradley always said I trusted you more than him," he said with a sad smile. "Perhaps because you always told me the truth even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear." He turned to Bradley, who stood rigid at the aircraft door. "Let him check the engine." "Dad, if we miss this window, then we miss it," William interrupted with unexpected strength. "I've lived 82 years, son. I'm not afraid of death. But I won't risk your lives or the pilots' lives on a dangerous flight." The resignation in the elder Davidson's voice seemed to break something in Bradley. His shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him all at once. "Check the engine," he told James, his voice hollow. James worked with controlled urgency, quickly locating the problem, a fuel line fitting that had worked loose during the earlier taxi and attempted takeoff. It was a simple fix, but a critical one. Had the aircraft taken off, the engine would likely have failed midway to Chicago. By the time he completed the repair, however, airport operations had officially closed. The storm had arrived in full force, rain lashing the hangar and thunder shaking the building. No flights would be permitted to leave until the severe weather had passed, likely several hours. The mood inside the aircraft was somber as this news was delivered. William sat with quiet dignity, holding his wife's hand. Sophia wept silently. Bradley stood at the window, staring out at the storm with empty eyes. "I'm truly sorry," James said, meaning it. Despite their earlier confrontations, he took no satisfaction in this outcome. "Not your fault," William said softly. "You did your job, kept us safe." Bradley turned suddenly. "There has to be another option, a different treatment facility, something." Allison looked up, a spark of hope lighting her exhausted features. "What about Mayo?" "They were our second choice, but Dr. Abrams said their protocol was nearly identical." "Rochester's only about 3 hours from here by car," Bradley said, calculation replacing despair. "If we left now." "In this storm," James interjected, "the roads will be dangerous." "We have no choice," Bradley insisted. "Dad, can you handle a car trip?" William nodded determinedly. "If it means we still have a chance, absolutely." A flurry of phone calls followed as Bradley contacted the Mayo Clinic. To everyone's relief, they agreed to accept William as an emergency case, extending their treatment window by 2 hours to accommodate the situation. "The ambulance can take us," Bradley announced after finishing the calls. "But the paramedics are concerned about road conditions. They're not confident they can make it through some of the rural areas in time." James, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "I know these roads better than anyone. Grew up here, driven through 50 years of Wisconsin storms. I can lead the ambulance, find the best routes." Bradley looked at him in surprise. "You would do that, after how I treated you today?" "This isn't about you or me," James said simply. "It's about getting your father to the treatment he needs." Within 30 minutes, they had transferred William back to the ambulance. James' pickup truck would lead, with Bradley following in his rental car. The small convoy would brave the storm together, navigating flooded roads and wind-whipped highways toward Rochester, Minnesota. As they prepared to leave, William asked to speak with James privately for a moment. "You never did cash that check I sent you after Vietnam," the elder Davidson said when they were alone. James looked surprised. "You knew about that?" "Of course I knew. I was trying to help without it seeming like charity." "You were too proud to accept it, just like you were too proud to accept my job offer." "It wasn't pride, Mr. Davidson," James said quietly. "It was wanting to make my own way." William nodded. "I've always respected that about you, even if I didn't understand it. My son is only beginning to learn that lesson." He paused, gathering strength. "Whatever happens today, promise me something." "Sir, Bradley's going to need guidance with the company. He's brilliant but impulsive. He's leveraged everything to keep Davidson Aviation independent, including mortgaging that plane you just saved. If I don't make it." "You'll make it," James said firmly. "If I don't," William continued, "he'll need someone who understands both the technical side and the value of patience, someone he might actually listen to eventually." James realized what William was asking. "Sir, I'm just a mechanic." "No," William said with conviction. "You're the man I should have made a partner 40 years ago, not just an employee. Don't make the same mistake I did. When Bradley comes to you, and he will say yes this time." Before James could respond, the paramedics indicated they needed to leave immediately if they were to have any chance of reaching Rochester in time. The journey through the storm was harrowing. Roads were flooded, visibility was poor, and twice they had to detour around fallen trees. James led them confidently, his truck's tires gripping the wet asphalt as he navigated from memory as much as sight. Halfway to Rochester, the ambulance radioed that William's condition was deteriorating. They needed to stop. In a small roadside diner that had emergency power from a generator, the paramedics stabilized William while James and Bradley stood outside under the awning, watching the rain. "He told you about the company, didn't he?" Bradley finally asked. James nodded. "Some of it. I had to leverage everything to keep us independent. The board wanted to sell to a conglomerate. My father built that company from nothing. I couldn't let it disappear into some corporate portfolio." "Sounds like you did what you thought was right," Bradley laughed bitterly. "And now it might all be for nothing, without this treatment." "Your father is a fighter," James said. "Like his son." Bradley looked at him in surprise. That almost sounded like a compliment. "Take it however you want," James replied with the ghost of a smile. When the paramedics indicated they could continue, the small convoy set off again into the storm. Against all odds, they reached Rochester just as the weather began to clear, the setting sun breaking through the clouds as they pulled up to the Mayo Clinic's entrance. Medical staff were waiting and quickly whisked William inside. The treatment window would close in 40 minutes. They had made it barely. In the waiting room, exhaustion finally overtook the Davidson family. Allison fell asleep in her chair while Sophia curled up on a small sofa. Bradley, however, remained awake, his posture rigid with tension. James, who had planned to leave once they arrived safely, found himself staying. Something in William's final request to him made it impossible to walk away now. "You don't have to wait," Bradley said after an hour of silence. "You've done more than enough." "I'll stay a bit longer," James replied. "If that's all right," Bradley nodded, then unexpectedly continued. "I found the letters, after my father got sick and I was organizing his papers. Letters you sent him from Vietnam, thanking him for looking out for you after your accident on the airfield." James stiffened slightly. "That was a long time ago. You wrote that he was the only officer who visited you in the hospital. That he made sure you got proper care when others were suggesting you be sent home with a basic disability pension." "He did right by me," James acknowledged. "Many wouldn't have. Yet you turned down his job offer after the war and again in '85 when our maintenance division was struggling." Bradley studied James carefully. "I never understood why." James was quiet for a long moment. "Your father built something important, something that was his. I needed to do the same in my own way. By fixing planes at a small regional airport. By building a life of my own choosing," James corrected gently. "Your father understood that eventually." Their conversation was interrupted as a doctor entered the waiting room. Both men stood immediately. "Mr. Davidson," the doctor addressed Bradley, "we've completed the initial treatment protocol. Your father is resting now." "Will it work?" Bradley asked, the question hanging desperately in the air. "It's too soon to know for certain," the doctor said carefully. "But I can tell you that we were able to administer the full treatment, and his initial response is encouraging. The next 48 hours will be critical." Relief washed over Bradley so powerfully that he had to sit down again. "Thank you," he managed. "When can we see him?" "He's asking for both of you," the doctor said, looking from Bradley to James. "He's quite insistent, actually." They found William in a private room, connected to various monitors but looking somehow stronger than he had earlier in the day. His eyes were clear as they entered. "You made it," he said with satisfaction. "Both of you together." "Save your strength, Dad," Bradley said, taking his father's hand. "I've saved my strength for too long," William replied. "It's time I spent it on what matters." He looked at James. "Did you tell him?" James shook his head. "Not my place, sir," William sighed. "Always so proper, Monroe," he turned back to his son. "I've made a decision about the company. I'm creating a new position, Chief Technical Advisor, reporting directly to you as CEO. James has agreed to take it." Bradley looked startled. "He has?" "Well, he will," William said with surprising firmness. "Because you're going to convince him. The company needs his expertise, especially with the vintage aircraft restoration division we've discussed. And you," he looked meaningfully at his son, "need someone who will tell you the truth even when you don't want to hear it." Bradley looked from his father to James, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Is that why you stayed, to take a job offer?" "I stayed because your father asked me to look out for his family," James said honestly. "The job is negotiable," William smiled weakly. "See, already telling it like it is." For the first time that day, Bradley Davidson laughed, a genuine sound of relief and perhaps newfound perspective. 3 months later, the 1962 Lockheed JetStar gleamed in the autumn sunlight outside Hangar 7 at Davidson Regional Airport. Its engines hummed perfectly as James Monroe conducted a final inspection before its commemorative flight. William Davidson, looking remarkably improved though still frail, sat in a wheelchair nearby, watching with approval. His experimental treatment had shown promising results, buying precious time that few had believed possible. "She sounds perfect," William commented as James closed an access panel. "Should do," James replied, "considering all the work that went into her." The restoration of the JetStar had become the flagship project for Davidson Aviation's new vintage aircraft division, headed by James in his role as Chief Technical Advisor. His acceptance of the position had surprised many at the airport, but not Raymond, who had simply said, "About time someone recognized what you're worth." Bradley approached, reviewing something on his tablet. In the months since the desperate race to Rochester, he had developed a genuine respect for James that went beyond his father's recommendation. They still clashed occasionally, Bradley's corporate instincts sometimes at odds with James' uncompromising standards, but the tension had become productive rather than adversarial. "The museum ceremony is scheduled for 2 o'clock, Bradley said. "Everyone's confirmed." The JetStar was making its final flight today, a short hop to the Air Transportation Heritage Museum in Minneapolis, where it would become a permanent exhibit. Part of the complex restructuring of Davidson Aviation had included donating the aircraft for a significant tax benefit while simultaneously launching the restoration division that would service similar vintage planes still in private hands. "Sophia's meeting us there?" William asked. Bradley nodded. "Straight from her campus tour at University of Minnesota. She's considering aerospace engineering now, apparently." William smiled knowingly at James. "Wonder where she got that idea." James shrugged modestly. The teenager had spent many hours during the summer watching him work, asking increasingly technical questions that revealed a natural aptitude for engineering. Allison joined them, elegant as always, but with a newfound warmth toward James that had developed during William's treatment and recovery. "The Historical Society wants to do an interview with both of you," she told James and William, "about your Vietnam connection and the full circle of this moment." William nodded thoughtfully. "Seems fitting. 50 years ago, James kept my plane flying in a war zone. Today, he's making sure its final flight is perfect." As the pilots arrived and began their pre-flight checks, Bradley drew James aside. "I have something for you," he said, handing James a small box. Inside was a set of keys and a miniature replica of the JetStar. "What's this?" James asked. "The keys to Hangar 3, Bradley explained. "For the new training program, the board approved it this morning." The program had been James' idea, a specialized technical school for aircraft mechanics focusing on vintage planes, giving disadvantaged young people a pathway into aviation careers. Bradley had initially resisted the cost, but had eventually become its strongest advocate to the board. "Thank you," James said, genuinely moved. "This will make a difference to a lot of young people." "Like you once were," Bradley acknowledged. "Dad told me about your early struggles, how hard it was to break into aviation maintenance without connections. This program changes that equation." As final preparations for takeoff were completed, the small group gathered to watch William board the aircraft. Despite his improving health, this would likely be his final flight in the plane that had been such an important part of his life. "Nervous?" James asked as he helped William up the steps. "Not with you checking the engines," William replied with a smile. "Besides, I've made my peace with a lot of things these past few months, including the possibility of not being here at all." Inside, William ran his hand lovingly over the restored interior. "She's as beautiful as the day I bought her." "Better," James corrected. "The new safety systems exceed anything available back then." William settled into his favorite seat by the window. "You know, when I was at my worst waiting for that treatment, I made a lot of promises to myself about what I'd do if I got more time." "Natural reaction," James said. "The difference is I'm keeping mine," William said firmly. "Starting with setting things right with you." He extended his hand. "Thank you, James, not just for the plane, for everything." James took the offered hand, the gesture sealing a circle that had begun decades earlier in a very different setting. Outside, Bradley and Allison waited to board. As James descended the steps to let them pass, Bradley paused. "My father always saw something in you that I was too proud to recognize," he admitted. "I'm glad I finally see it, too." "Better late than never," James replied with the hint of a smile. "For both of us." As the JetStar taxied toward the runway for its final journey, James stood watching, a complex mixture of emotions playing across his weathered face. Raymond joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "Never thought I'd see the day you become a corporate executive," Raymond teased. "Technical advisor," James corrected. "No corner office for me?" "Still, it's a far cry from where you were 3 months ago," James nodded thoughtfully. "Life takes unexpected turns sometimes." They watched as the vintage aircraft gracefully accelerated down the runway and lifted into the clear autumn sky, its aluminum skin catching the sunlight. "You saved more than just that plane, you know," Raymond said after a moment. "The whole Davidson family was falling apart before you stepped in." "They saved themselves," James replied. "I just gave them a little time to figure things out." As the JetStar disappeared into the distance, James thought about the young mechanic he'd once been in Vietnam, afraid and injured, and the young officer who had taken the time to ensure he received proper care. He thought about his own son Michael, now a successful pilot, and young Sophia Davidson, possibly the next generation of aviation engineers. Some debts could never be fully repaid, as William had written in his note. But sometimes, life offered the chance to complete the circle in unexpected ways. The JetStar's journey was ending today, but the connections it had created would continue, extending far beyond a single vintage aircraft or the people who had once kept it flying. "Ready to go see that plane land for the last time?" Raymond asked. James nodded, a sense of completion settling over him. "Ready," Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.